can see it because he is perfection. He can see it all. That's why I told you he's infinite. Yes, that means there is no end to him. His perfection knows no beginning and no end. He is perfection. Do you understand that? That's why he can see even the things that are invisible. Because he is perfection and he exists in a place that's higher than everything else. It's like God is in an airplane or a helicopter looking down on everything. And by everything, I'm not talking about just the earth. I'm talking about the second heaven as well. And everything in between that and third heaven. He sees it all. The third heaven is where he reigns supreme. At the pinnacle of everything. The pinnacle means the tip-top point. Hey, welcome to By Faith and Grace Alone. My name is Hector. I'd like to welcome you to this beautiful Saturday where we will study the book of Proverbs. As you guys remember, we did leave off in chapter 2, so without further ado, grab a bowl of cereal, grab a cup of coffee, and enjoy your Saturday morning. Let's start off with the book of Proverbs, chapter 2. If we read chapter 2, it will read as follows. It will read, "My son, if you receive my word and treasure my commands within you, so that you incline your ear to wisdom and apply your heart to understanding. Yes, if you cry out for discernment and lift your voice for understanding, if you seek her as silver and you search for her as hidden treasure, then you will understand the fear of the Lord and find the knowledge of God. For the Lord gives wisdom, from his mouth come knowledge and understanding. He stores up sound wisdom for the upright. He is a shield for those who walk uprightly. He guards the path of justice and preserves the way of his saints. Then you will understand righteousness and justice, equity, and every good path. When wisdom enters your heart and knowledge is pleasant to your soul, discretion will preserve you and understanding will keep you, to deliver you from from the way of evil, from the man who speaks perverse things, from those who leave the paths of the uprightness to walk in the ways of darkness, who rejoice in doing evil and delight in the perversity of the wicked, whose ways are crooked and who are devious in their paths, to deliver you from the immoral woman and from the seductress who flatters with her words, who forsakes the companion of her youth and forgets the covenant of her God. For her house leads down to death and her paths to dead. None who go to her return, nor do they regain the path of life. So you may walk in the way of goodness and keep for the paths of righteousness. For the upright will dwell in the land, and the blameless will remain in it. But the wicked will be cut from the earth, and the unfaithful will be uprooted from it." Okay, let's move over to the ICB one, just to kind of get a little different version going on, Saturday morning. It reads, "My child, believe what I say and remember what I command you. Listen to wisdom. Try with all of your heart to gain understanding. Cry out for wisdom. Beg for understanding. Search for it as you would for silver. Hunt for it like hidden treasure. Then you will understand what it means to respect the Lord. Then you will begin to know God. Only the Lord gives wisdom. Knowledge and understanding comes from him. He stores up wisdom for those who are honest. Like a shield, he protects those who are innocent. He guards those who are fair to others. He protects those who are loyal to him. Then you will understand what is honest and fair and right. Then you will understand what is good. Then you will have wisdom in your heart, and knowledge will be pleasing to you. Good sense will protect you. Understanding will guard you. It will keep you from doing evil. It will save you from people whose words are bad. Such people do not do what is right. They do what is evil. They enjoy doing wrong. They are happy to do what is crooked and evil. what they do is wrong. Their ways are dishonest. It will save you from the unfaithful wife who tries to lead you into adultery with pleasing words. Such women leave the husband they married when they were young. They forget the promise they made before God. If you go to her house, you are on your way to death. What she does leads to death. No one who goes to her comes back. He will not continue to live. But wisdom will help you be a good person. It will help you do what is right. Those who are honest will stay in the land, but those who are innocent will remain in it. But evil people will be removed from the land, and the unfaithful will be thrown out of it. Okay, so that is the ICB version. So if we take a moment to kind of, you know, reflect on what it is saying, we kind of take a note in verse 1. Verse 1, Solomon opens up the chapter with a plea to the heart, as if to be pleading with his son. He makes his son take a decision on whether or not his words have any weight. Essentially, we kind of see here, right here on verse 1, where he full on says, "My son, if you receive my words and treasure my commands within you." So Solomon in reality is just kind of making a plea to his son. He's really kind of trying to like tell him, hey, you know what, I'm your dad, I'm trying to kind of give you some wisdom, but the fact of the matter becomes, it's like, will you listen to it? Will you value it? Will you give it its weight and the actual respect that it deserves? Bear in mind, again, by this time Solomon was like super famous. People would come from all over the land in order to hear this man speak, but even then, so he still gives that moment for his children to kind of decide whether or not they want to listen to their father. And it's an interesting thing, because realistically, the only person that can learn, the only person that can actually truly walk and get to know God is really the person who wants to do so. It's impossible for you to force someone onto the path. The only thing that you can technically do is only negotiate ever so much. In other words, when we talk about the concepts of, for example, raise up children in the path so that when they grow up, they don't steer away from it. Essentially, what it is saying, it's not that you're gonna bend their knee and force them to be on there for hours on end. What it's talking about is kind of a plea. It's kind of like this concept where you kind of speak to the heart, where you really try your absolute best to kind of raise up children, where you try your absolute best to have them understand the concepts, the feelings, the emotions, the how sacred the Word of God is, how important prayer is, the search for God, and it's something where it begins in the heart. Yes, you take them to church even when they don't want to. Yes, you basically regulate what they consume, but it doesn't come from a point of religiousness. It comes from a point of wisdom. Solomon here is kind of telling him, hey, will you take weight to the words that I'm giving you? And realistically, I think that's kind of the issue at hand, especially like when we kind of like look at like on a more like personal level. Like, okay, you go to church, you sit down, you listen to the preacher man preach, and you listen to you essentially listen to someone give you a word. And the question becomes, do we give weight to what is being preached to us? Do you give weight to what you're being taught? Do you give weight to what your father is telling you? And essentially, I mean, we can like go back and forth and really kind of like try to check out the dynamic between the concepts of a spiritual father, a father that's in heaven and the father that's on earth. But essentially, when we look at the dynamic of family, that it's essentially supposed to be the dynamic of what God's relationship is in humanity. So in other words, for example, we have the concepts of a husband and a wife, the concept of, as Paul said in Ephesians, it's like, husbands, give yourselves or love yourselves, love your wife the way that Christ loved the church, essentially. And it says, wives, you know what I mean, submit to the husband, which is the head of the household, and God or Christ is the head of the husband. In other words, it's kind of going in and it's talking about us wrestling with the fact of not only us loving, you know what I mean, or receiving the love that God gives us, but also submitting onto Him. And it's interesting because in recent times, with the attack that society has on the biblical family, as it was, or as it were, we see that these walls are trying to break them down. They're trying to break down what God has established, when in reality, what God, from the very beginning, what He was trying to show was, it's like the importance of God in man's life, and He does it brilliantly when He blesses us with the covenant of marriage. He said, "Hey, it's not, right for the man to be alone." Uh, and essentially, it is right. And if we bear in mind, this was prior to the fall of man, which means that should Adam have fallen before Eve came onto the scene, then that means that Adam would have lived his entire life in solitude, being the only thing living the rest of his days out to die alone. And even so, God did not allow that. He, in His great mercy, gave him a companion, even when He knew that there would be a moment when a man would be separated from him. And when we kind of come over down this way, something to kind of bear note is, as a small nod to Proverbs 1, it's of extreme importance, the concept that Solomon has a stance on the importance of discipline, beginning in the household, so much so that it's in fact paramount. The fact that he goes as far as to say that the wisdom that parents share, it brings honor. It's like chains around your neck. It's like an ornament on your head. That's really the way that he describes it. And when we take all these things into consideration, it's absolutely worth noting the things that he compares wisdom that parents impart. It's really something that kind of wisdom, it brings honor, it brings prosperity, because essentially we're not talking about someone giving you wisdom in theory, but rather someone giving you wisdom because they just want to see you succeed. In verse 2 to 3, we see Solomon is using his child's trust to validate the importance of wisdom in his life, despite having authority to force his child to study Proverbs, or to simply guide him in a set of instructions. Solomon's interest is that of a father. It's like that of a father teaching a child to fend for themselves. In other words, instead of diving into rules to live by, it's like, oh, well, you can't do it because you're a prince. You can't do it because you're a king. Oh, you can't do this because of that. Much like, for example, many times we tell people, oh, you can't do this because you just can't do it. Realistically, instead of him being able to just dive into rules, be like, you just can't do this, or set norms as wisdom, you know what I mean? Like, he really tries to ask his son to lend him his ear, as opposed to a culture or the norms that we've set as society. Wisdom, Solomon knew that wisdom would guide his son in all areas. And something that we should definitely note should be how the heart of a father pleads with the son to not only weigh the words that he is speaking, but the fact that he is telling his child is something that will lead him closer to God. Especially in verse 5, it's quite common to see parents steer, their children in like a certain direction. I know for like a fact, it's like something that, like, I think every culture has, is that they do their absolute best to, like, kind of be like, oh, you have to go to school. Oh, you have to follow in your father's footsteps. Your father was a construction worker. You have to be a construction worker. And if you don't want to be a construction worker, well, your uncle's a plumber, so be a plumber. It's like, or you have the other ones that are like, you have to go to school and be a doctor. Yeah, there's no other option but to be a doctor. It's either a doctor or a lawyer. And it's like really interesting because, especially like those traditions haven't really changed in today's world. We still, generally speaking, try our absolute best to kind of tell our youth, do this, do that, and we try to guide them down a path. Especially like if it has to do with like some kind of a career or something. It's something that we just, as a society, we perpetuate over and over and over again. We don't have enough lawyers, we don't have enough doctors in the world, and we just constantly try to force people into like a mold, depending on what we think would be a wise thing. And when we look at it, instead of being able to like kind of guide his child down any path that you can imagine, because Solomon could have like quite literally have told his child, it's like I conquered intellectually, people respect me, so our country has fame. Your grandfather, he literally conquered or drove out the rest of the people, and by the end of it all of our enemies were kind of destroyed. Instead of being like, oh, well, now you have to go and conquer everyone around you and literally become the sole kingdom on the earth, instead of doing that, I mean, at this point in Solomon's life, he still treasures and values God so much so that instead of telling his son to be a conqueror, instead of telling his son to be the richest king that has ever walked the earth, he literally goes and tells him, hey, you know what, go and get closer to God. And it's interesting because when you kind of like look at it, despite all of Solomon's shortcomings, he didn't want his son to be a conqueror or to rule with an iron fist. Rather, the only thing that he wanted was for him to lead a path of wisdom, and essentially that path would eventually lead to God, as we know. Again, small nods to chapter 1, where he's like, the beginning of wisdom is the fear of the Lord. And essentially he's trying to make sure his son walks down the path of the Lord. And when we go down to verses 4 to 5, it says, "If you seek her as silver, and you search for her as for hidden treasures, then you will understand the fear of the Lord, and find the knowledge of God." And if we kind of take a look at those things, verse 4 to 5, Solomon does his best to compare the value of wisdom, declaring that wisdom far outweighs silver or hidden treasures, and that if we were to put in the effort to obtain wisdom, then understand the fear of the Lord, and then we would find the knowledge of God. Essentially, he's kind of really trying to make things as mundane as possible. There are people who like kind of go and they try to like, make it as like, like as super complicated as possible. They're like, oh, you kind of have to do this, you have to do that, you have to go to this to the mountains and you have to, there's a certain order, there's a certain, format of how you have to do things. And essentially Solomon really kind of is going into the heart of the issue, and he's essentially not telling us, hey, you have to do this in this specific way. What he's really technically telling us is your main objective should be to quite literally look for God the way that you look for the riches on this earth. You have to like put everything aside, and sometimes you have to sacrifice yourself. But if you were to look for it with passion, if you were to look for God or wisdom the way that we do for money, in other words, just like we don't stop going to work because, oh, I just don't want to today, or oh, because I'm tired. If we were to like quite literally and quite genuinely be like, hey, no, I'm going to go, I'm tired, I'm going to pray, I'm going to read, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, I'm going to look for him even though I'm not feeling at 100. If we were to take that kind of an attitude, our relationship with God would be entirely different. And something that's worth considering is the concept of searching for it. As we search for treasures, is not a comparison. That's it's not made by coincidence. It's quite the opposite. The book of Proverbs is written from a viewer's perspective. It kind of goes like, oh, look at the young man, look at the sinner, look at the foolish. The concept that there are people who spend their entire lives devoting their life to finding treasures in this world. That's essentially what he's kind of trying to like give that concept that it's like, hey, there are people who look at the people who essentially make it a point to be rich on earth. They don't take days off. They don't try to find the easy way out. In other words, okay, the person who truly wants to be rich does not spend their entire day playing the lottery or gambling their money away. Most of them will literally go and work extremely hard to make sure that they have a better life tomorrow. They save, they invest, they do a lot of things to make sure that their money is being utilized as wisely as possible. And that's essentially what he's kind of saying. Like, look at the habits of all these people. If you were to look for it the way that people look for gold, for silver, how much different would our life be if we were to take our time and invest it wisely the way that we do our money? And of course, I mean, then there's the other concept where it's like, well, do we know how to invest our money? Do we know how to like kind of safeguard our money and our wealth? And that's a whole conversation for a different other day. But what he's really essentially talking about is, just like people desire the treasures of this world, we should surely try to desire the treasures of heaven. And surely silver has value, and surely it has a specific value once it is minted. So, for example, when we have like quarters and things of that nature, you know a quarter or a silver, anything, even if we would make it like a little, if we were to make a round like a quarter, exact same dimensions and everything, but if it is not printed, it is quite literally, we would have to weigh the silver to find out how much the silver weighs. The moment that we print that, we mint it, or we print it, or we stamp it with some kind of like official seals or something, much like a quarter has, like the face of a president and like the eagle in the back or what have yous on it. Essentially, those that piece of silver officially has a specific value, something that it shows. The interesting thing about it is that's kind of how we see it, and we're like, okay, well, this tiny little quarter is worth 25 cents. It has a face of a president, it has an eagle in the back, or whatever the actual image is in the back nowadays. But if you kind of like think about it, that's one side of the story. The fact of the matter is, we don't know what the perils were to search for the silver. There were men. Okay, I'm not talking about like just any kind of men. No, we're talking about like men that were willing to put their lives on the line to go mine this in a cave somewhere. These people, they went and they risked their lives. They went into their very dangerous places where they did not know if they were going to be coming back out alive. But essentially, there were people that died searching for this piece of gold, for this piece of silver. And although we give it a 25-cent value, there is so much more value in that quarter in the long run than what we give it. And that's kind of how the treasures of heaven are. Sometimes we see it's like, oh, it's like that man has an anointings. But realistically, there is a story behind that anointings. There's a path of tears that person has walked, a path of sacrifice that person has walked. And when you kind of like really like take all of that into account, we really should kind of really go into this concept realistically, where we should understand that nothing comes easy in life, and wisdom does not come easy either. The anointings of God does not come easy as well. The ability to give a word, the ability to have a strong conviction does not come easy. It's something where we kind of have to, in some ways, continuously work for. And Solomon is really truly like amazing in the sense that how he describes it, in the sense that I'm sure everyone knows the one person that's constantly on the grind, that's constantly working, that doesn't take a day off, that's constantly doing overtime. Well, if we were to take that kind of tenacity and apply it to our spiritual life, our spiritual life would be entirely different. Verses 6 to 9, we see Solomon go out and go and continue down this proverb. He says, "For the Lord gives wisdom; from his mouth cometh knowledge and understanding. He stores up sound wisdom for the upright. He is a shield for those who walk uprightly. He guards the path of justice and preserves the way of his saints. Then you will understand righteousness and justice, equity, and every good path." Solomon does not only reveal where wisdom comes from, but he also reveals who is the keeper of wisdom and her ways. Something that he does list, or the things that the Lord is that he shields those who walks upright, or those that walk with dignity. He guards the roads of the justice. In other words, he assures that true justice is never corrupted. He preserves the way of the saints. He keeps the righteous on their walks. And it is in this that you will learn what righteousness, justice, and equity and the good path are. Something that definitely comes to mind for sure is the book of James, chapter 3, verse 15. And it says, "This wisdom does not descend from above, but is earthly, sensual, and demonic. But the wisdom that is from above is pure, then peaceable, gentle, and willing to yield, full of mercy and good fruits, without partiality and without hypocrisy." In other words, there is this interesting thing that you will receive wisdom from everyone on this earth, because everyone's a wise man, apparently. But something that's really interesting is the fact that here Solomon is saying, everyone claims to have wisdom, but realistically, wisdom comes from one place, and that place is God. And when we kind of go a little further in, he kind of goes really, really deep into detail in the fact that he says, God is the one that will teach you righteousness. He is the one that will shield you, and he is the one that will keep you on your path. In other words, he is going to go as far as to say that essentially these things that God gives onto you, they teach you how to live life with true wisdom. It's something that will not stray you from the path of God. And sometimes people say, "Oh, it's like you need to do this." It doesn't matter realistically what God thinks. It doesn't matter, if something is just. If you're, sometimes there's white lies, but something that that is said on here is the concept that he will teach you the ways of justice. In other words, our justice and his justice are entirely different. We will justify. We are going to justify why we're lying. We're going to justify why we're cheating. We're going to justify why it is that we're doing what we're doing in reality. You know what I mean? When we really boil all of this down, our paths of wisdom are really technically paths that lead us down a very dark place, a very bad place. And essentially, when he comes and he goes and he speaks and he really comes and elaborates in many ways, you know what I mean? The fact that people don't know what true wisdom is. People don't know what true justice is. People don't know what compassion is. And it's because, much like James kind of puts it, it's like there is a wisdom that does not descend from above. This one is earthly. In other words, it's constantly being fueled by the flesh and feelings. It is sensual. In other words, it uses lust. It uses perversion to get what it wants. It is demonic. In other words, it is something that comes from a very dark place. But wisdom that is from above, okay? It is first pure. That means that it's not something that comes with interest. It says that it is then peaceable. It's not something that wages war. It is gentle. It is not something that causes harm. It is willing to yield. It is willing to say that I am wrong. And it brings good fruits. In other words, the fruits of the Spirit. And it is without partiality. In other words, it does not bode toward, well, this is convenient to me, so this has to be right. And it is without hypocrisy. In other words, you are not one thing in front of someone and a whole different other thing in front of a whole different other person. And, there are many people that claim to have wisdom and have learned it from somewhere or someone. One thing that can be certain, and that is God stores up wisdom to the upright. And that not all wisdom comes from God. There's wisdom that comes from a different fountain, which leads to a different end in our walk with God. And the more we know Him, the more we understand what true righteousness, justice, and equity and the good path is. The more closer we have to come to be with the one who gives us heavenly wisdom. And then, of course, verses 10 to 11. It reads, when wisdom enters your heart and knowledge is pleasant to your soul, discretion will preserve you and understanding will keep you. So in other words, Solomon is quick to point out the process by which wisdom affects our life. Wisdom will not only become part of our life, but it will change us and it will keep us. I'm repeat that. It's going to change us and it's going to keep us. Unlike the material in this world, which is external, wisdom is something that enters us, it keeps us, and it changes us from the inside out. The truly wise man will not only follow wisdom to enter, but to change his nature. The concept of knowledge is pleasant to your soul is something that can be summarized as follows. Acting in wisdom is no longer a chore. Repeat that. Acting in wisdom is no longer a chore. That means it's no longer hard to act with wisdom. It's no longer hard to try to yield. In other words, where like someone is arguing, and even though sometimes inside of you, you know that you are right, but the fight is not worth it. The fight is not worth the repercussions that are going to come from it. You are willing to yield, and it's no longer a chore, but rather it is pleasant to you. And when we kind of come on to this, we see on here, it says, my comment says, wisdom will surely change the most unrestrained man into a man of discretion. So many times it is difficult to fulfill the Father's will, God's will. But when He abides in us, then wisdom is in us and knowledge is pleasant to our soul. David, in Psalms 40, verse 8, he says, I delight to do your will, O my God, and your law is within my heart. Those are the words of David. Those are the words that David proclaimed. David was no fool. He wasn't. But his wisdom also could not compare to Solomon's wisdom. But yet, David lived with God's law in his heart, and he delighted in God's law. And that's something that can be said, that can't be said about many other people. See, David found delight in God. David found delight in his law. And most of the time, unfortunately, the way we see it, especially down this path, that's kind of an extremely hard it's an extremely hard quality to find in a person. Someone who apparently does not look at the laws or the prescriptions that God has given us and delights in them instead of using it as something to judge others or taking it as a cross. It's extremely hard, but the Bible says that Jesus put joy and love. He put all these great emotions and feelings in front of the cross. So despite the fact that he was carrying the cross, there was true joy. There was true joy that was leading him to the path, on the path that he was walking. And when we read verses 12 to 15, it reads as follows: to deliver you from the way of evil, from the man who speaks perverse things, from those who leave the paths of uprightness to walk in the ways of darkness, who rejoice in doing evil and delight in the perversity of the wicked, those who are crooked and those who are devious in their paths. In other words, Solomon in chapter 1 advises against the counsels of the wicked. Here, he no longer sees it as an invitation to hurt others, but rather as treachery that will one day harm you. Solomon does not. Solomon does his absolute best to show his son that wisdom must deliver us from evil people and their ways. His criteria for identifying these people are as follows: they speak perverse things, they leave the upright path, the ways of God. They walk in darkness, always do things out of sight, and they rejoice in evil, delight in perversity, and they are crooked and devious in their paths. So, this can't be understated. We need wisdom to choose who our friends are. There is a concept that Solomon decides to employ, which is devious paths. By nature, there are people who are devious, whose heart is nowhere near God. Food for thought. Israel means he who wrestles with God. Israel, due to their humane and sinful nature, spent the better part of their walk with God fighting and wrestling with him. But they never had the title Satan or Satan. The title Satan, because yes, Satan is a title, it is not an actual name, means enemy or the opposer. It quite literally means he who opposes God. The Hebrew word Satan. And due to our fallen nature, like Israel, we might fight and wrestle with God at every turn. But there are others who oppose him in his will. They walk in darkness because they have chosen darkness. Truly, something that is definitely worth noting is the fact that Paul writes, for those who live according to the flesh set their minds on the things of the flesh, but those who live according to the Spirit, the things of the Spirit. That's in Romans 8:5. In other words, if we are to delight in knowledge, or like David, delight in doing his will, how can we fellowship with those who delight is to revel in sin? I think that there's really no way to kind of like really kind of spin this the way that he speaks, the way that he says it, which is they speak perverse things. So in other words, they try to make perversion infiltrate you via your ears. They leave the upright path, people who absolutely abandon the laws of God. They walk in darkness. I think this is like kind of like the one that kind of really drove it home, at least for me. Even more so than rejoicing in evil and delighting in perversity. I think that right here, right where he says they walk in darkness, I think right there, that's I think the hardest one of all. And it's the hardest one of all because many times we choose our friends based off who we grew up around or people that, we feel comfortable around. And yet, sometimes because of this love, because of this history that we have with people, something that's definitely worth noting is the fact that we tend to want to overlook people's shortcomings. In other words, he's my best friend. He's cheating on his wife. She's cheating on her husband. They're cheating on their boyfriend and girlfriend. But because they're my boy, because they're my girl, I can't. I can't. I absolutely can't say anything. I'm gonna, be, what I mean, the best friend and just stay quiet, and I'm gonna support them all the way through. Because it's like we have to be, loyal. That's my crew. That's my squad. I don't know. That's basically my group of people. We choose. Bear this in mind. We choose to walk with unrighteous people because there is a part of us somewhere within our nature that is just as sinful as they are. And the problem becomes, it's like what 2 Corinthians says, 6:14, where it says, do not be unequally yoked together with unbelievers. For what fellowship has righteousness with lawlessness, and what communion has light with darkness? See, I'm not saying, because I'm definitely not the person that's gonna tell you, hey, you know, you're going to, like, just leave everyone who's not Christian behind. I'm not. But there are people who sin and will try to dirty your heart, to contaminate it, because that's how their heart already is. And many times we don't want to see it this way, but the fact of the matter becomes this. It's like, what testimony can a Christian have when, even if they don't drink, they're found in a bar around people who can't even stand up straight? And that's their Saturday afternoon, where they're the sober driver. I don't drink, but I'm going to just go. What kind of testimony can that be for a preacher that cannot distinguish what is wise from what is unwise, what is light from what is darkness? There's the concept that we must have communication even with those that do not have faith. There is a difference between interaction out of necessity, and there's a difference between being yoked with someone who is running a different race altogether. We're specifically running a very specific race. There are people who are not running the same race that we're racing. In fact, they're running the exact opposite way. And something that's I definitely want to drive this point home is the concept that it's like, Jesus, when he sat with people that were not, of the faith, he, of course, he did show love and he did show compassion. And there was really no judgment in the way that he approached them, in the sense that he condemned them. He did condemn the Pharisees. He did not condemn the sinner, because the sinner still had time. Even though the Pharisees still had time, but their heart had already decided what they wanted and how they wanted it. But the sinners, he did give them a chance. He did go in this way. He kind of went ahead and was like, hey, like the Samaritan woman. It's like, you say that, your husband, but you've had a bunch of them. This one ain't yours either. There was no judgment in that. There was just a simple observation of the way that she was living life. And today, when we live in a society where it's like we just don't want to offend anyone, it's like we just can't. It's how can we? We shouldn't. It's really hard, honestly. It's extremely hard for us to like be completely like, oh, hey, you're sinning, because automatically that's like offensive to someone. But how can you truly say you love someone when you know they're walking down a path that leads straight to hell, and you choose not to say anything to them? Realistically, there is a balance. There's genuinely a balance. There was a multitude. Jesus actually fed them physically, and he taught them. Many times as people, we don't know how to kind of balance this out. It's like we either go full on social justice warrior, or we go full on super spiritual, where it's like, oh, you're hungry, well, guess what, I don't have food, I'm not going to give you money, but just sit down and listen. It's like, and both of them kind of are carried hand in hand. And it's fine to be, have some kind of interaction with people that are not of the faith, so long as they don't try to make you run their path, make you run their race. But just like that, it's also okay to explain to them why it is extremely important to walk this race that we're living in right now. And we're at the home stretch. Verse 16 on, it says, to deliver you from the immoral woman, from the seductress who flatters with her words, who forsakes the companion of her youth and forgets the covenant of her God. For her house leads down to death, and her path to the dead. None who go to her return, nor do they regain the paths of life. So you may walk in the ways of goodness, and keep you from the path, keep you to the paths of righteousness. For the upright will dwell in the land, and the blameless will remain in it. But the wicked will be cut from the earth, and the unfaithful will be uprooted from it. So, something worth noting. 100%. The sexes can be inverted. Bear in mind, again, the book of Proverbs was written as a book of observation. In other words, he tells us, look at the sinner, look at the just, look at the young man, look at the adulterous woman, look at the look at the harlot. It's Solomon basically kind of pointing out, different things, different scenarios, and all while illustrating it as a conversation that he's having with his child. So bear in mind, obviously, he's talking to his son, so of course he's going to use the concept of the immoral woman. But bear in mind that this applies to women as well. The immoral man. Although Solomon does not speak of many women in the book of Proverbs, although Solomon does speak about many women in the book of Proverbs, because there's definitely more than one, and each one of them is very vastly different from the other. Their architect types of women. In other words, the one that you see here today is not the one that you're going to see like in chapter 6 or 7. It's not the one that you're going to see, and definitely not the one you see in chapter 31. But it's definitely worth noting that this is a very different woman. This woman is not the harlot that it speaks of in later chapters. This woman is a woman who is immoral and seeks attention. The best way to describe her would be an adulteress. In other words, a woman who steps out of her marriage. A woman who forgets the laws of God, abandoning her spouse for a moment of pleasure. So in other words, that could also be a man that does that. Solomon does not only tell us what the outcome of her household is, but the fact that she is a path that leads to the grave. We must consider the following. Solomon, before describing her as a path of death, paints a picture of her allure. She is a seductress. She flatters with her words. In other words, she is a flirt. And much like the serpent in the Garden of Eden, the fruits of sin are as appetizing as it was on that day that Adam and Eve failed. And its consequences remain the same as well. It's death. Much like a man once dead cannot lead you down to death, Much like a man once dead cannot regain life, when the adulterous woman sinks her fangs in, her venom shall take you and lead you down to death. There is an unfortunate truth in all of this, and that is that her house leads down to death. In other words, she does not only lead the person who commits adultery with her down to death, but her entire household as a whole suffers death because of her, or because of him. In this case, biblically her. See, adultery is not a sin that drags you down or drags down your life, but it literally drags everyone's life around you. It drags your children's life. It drags your family honors, your family's honor through the dirt. It drags your spouse's life through the dirt. It's something where this woman decided to step out of the covenant that she made before the Lord, with her spouse and the Lord. She's her children and her husband lie in a grave known previously as her household. There is this concept, okay? There is this definite concept, that this is ancient knowledge, and that, it's like they can't really, it doesn't matter. And many people kind of go and they try to definitely make different, kind of communities. You have, like, for example, like the red pill community, the manosphere. You have the, feminism, other side of the spectrum as well. And everyone says, oh yeah, biblically this is all ancient knowledge and it's no good for today's date, which is totally not true. Statistically, everything that this has just described is 100% accurate. And of course, we're not going to get into that, but, essentially when children, grow up in a one parent household, specifically because, there was adultery, there was infidelity. Those children are more likely to choose a spouse that is abusive, that will also be unfaithful to them, and it's a very sad reality. But there's this vicious cycle that kind of happens over and over and over and over again, and the Bible clearly gives us a prescription here, and that prescription is to be wary and realistically to completely avoid the immoral man and the immoral woman. In fact, quite literally, this entire chapter is David talking about the counsels of evil men and being able to heed what are the wise words of the Father, being able to understand that righteousness will not only guide you in your path, but it will protect you from the people who are unrighteous around you. When you are surrounded by immoral people, unfortunately, immorality will find some way of touching your life. There is a saying out there, which is, you play silly games, you win silly prizes. Well, this is literally that. That in a nutshell. It's the concept that's like, when we play games with our lives, and we're like, oh, the word of God says this, but I'm truly wise. God will protect me even though I'm stepping out of what his prescription for my life is. I'm going to kind of, slightly dabble here, slightly dabble there. Oh, I'm going to win this man for the Lord. I'm going to win this woman for the Lord. The rule is you will fail 99% of the time. That's the rule. The exception, there is an exception. The question becomes, even though there are exceptions to the rule, but mind you, the people who are the exceptions to the rule did not know they were going to be the exception to the rule. That happened to be that just happened to coincide with God's plan at the time. But when we play these silly games, we win silly prizes. And the fact of the matter becomes this: there's more of a possibility of us not being the exception, but rather being the rule. And if we choose, again, this is a concept of choice. If we choose that we want to play silly games and not listen to the counsel of God, but rather listen to the counsel of the wicked, which, mind you, as the Bible says, they're vicious. They're vicious people. They definitely are not doing their absolute best to make sure that we have a good life, but rather there's treachery afoot. We will find ourselves in silly circumstances or less than favorable situations in our life. It literally ends. This chapter literally ends with saying, so you may walk in the way of goodness and keep to the paths of righteousness. For the upright will dwell in the land, and blameless will remain in it. In other words, those who follow the prescription of God to the T, their path will more than likely not be around the immoral man or the immoral woman, because most of them will flee from it. And I'm not talking about, oh, they'll never go to church. No, you'll probably sit next to them. You could probably sit next to an immoral man or immoral woman in a church, especially if Christ, 100% of the time, if Christ has not been, you know what I mean, is not in them, you will 100% of the time, regardless of them going to your local church, find yourself, you know what I mean, surrounded with bad company. And this isn't like a call to like literally isolate people. This is a call to quite literally know who's around you and use wisdom to decide whether my wisdom, which is humane, will trump God's wisdom, which comes from above. Those who are righteous will walk the path of God, and they won't stray from it, and God will take care of their every need, so that they will remain in the land. Remember, the land was a blessing. But it goes on as far as to say, the wicked will be cut from the earth, and the unfaithful will be uprooted from it. In other words, there is pain involved. There is major pain involved when we decide to just 100% of the way step to the right, step to the left, and veer completely from what God wants in our life. I know that we've definitely kind of overlapped a lot of things, and we definitely have already gone into the hour, but I definitely do want to thank you for, definitely do want to call you, I do want to thank you, for being tuned on this Saturday morning. And, I definitely, unfortunately, am unable to check out what are the actual comments, unfortunately, for this. But as of right now, but what we can do is I will take the questions that are on the chat, if any, and I am going to I'll make another live stream answering those questions, and hopefully when that does happen, we are in a we are in a good place to answer a lot of these. So having said that, do want to thank you again for watching this video. And remember, everything that we have, everything that we are, is only through the faith and grace alone. Okay, guys, you have a good one. Take care.